to Seattle Atheist Church. Atheists, agnostics, skeptics, whatever you like to call yourself, you are welcome here. At Seattle Atheist Church, we call ourselves an atheist church because we'll never hear anything supernatural promoted from the podium. Our church was founded on the principles of scientific naturalism and secular ethics. Truth claims are attempted here, and we stand ready to revise our thinking in light of new information. We attempt to be excellent to all conscious beings, and we believe in good, because good works in non-mysterious ways. If that sounds good to you, then you are in the right place. The members ourselves give the talks, and then afterwards we'll get into a circle and have discussion. We have a planning meeting every 3 months, and everyone is invited to participate. And I don't think there's anything coming up, but like the third Saturday of the month, we'll have our Saturday Secular Social at Browers. That's at 3 p.m. at Browers in Fremont. Thanks very much.
Hi, I'm Eva. If you saw the description of my talk online, it's called Antifascism, What, How, and Why. And the description is, anti-fascism movements have arisen in history when government forces have become increasingly oppressive and violent. This talk will address the history and content of anti-fascism and the most effective forms of anti-fascist action in history and today. Let's start with some basics, though, because people are often confused about them. What are we talking about when we talk about anti-fascism? Let's start with what's fascism. Here's the Wikipedia definition. Fascism is a form of radical, authoritarian ultranationalism characterized by dictatorial power, forcible suppression of opposition, and strong regimentation of society and of the economy, which came to prominence in early 20th century Europe. We're not talking about just an insulting word to call your political opponents. We're talking about something with a real meaning. It can be a little confusing to define, though, because fascism isn't tied to a specific ideology or even a specific political structure. It's a set of tactics and priorities which may be associated with almost any claims about the values and intentions of its practitioners. Fascism may come out in the trappings of any belief system, and those beliefs will be dropped as soon as they're not helpful to the goals of fascism. So I wanted to put that out there to begin with. Mussolini said that his movement did not feel tied to any particular doctrinal form. Our myth is the nation, and to this myth, to this grandeur, we subordinate all the rest. The nation is first, and the nation is conceived of as being a particular subset of the people of that nation. Anything else doesn't matter. Historian Robert Paxton says fascists reject any universal value other than the success of chosen peoples in a Darwinian struggle for primacy. So fundamentally, fascism is nationalism and tribalism. It's support of an allegedly superior in-group at the expense of all other groups, with the force of the government, police, and military increasingly behind it. That's what we're talking about when we talk about fascism. In the US, people often associate fascism with communism. This is a serious error. It's a category error to start with. Communism being a political system and fascism being an approach to power and supremacy. It's also very unfair to the many communist anti-fascists who have been really important in the history of fighting fascism. And I'll certainly go into that quite a bit later. Our educational system and our media tend to encourage thinking of fascism as something that's very alien to the US. It happens other places. This is also a really deep error. Fascism has been with us since the founding of our country. Slavery, the genocide and driving to reservations of Native Americans, Jim Crow laws, the internment of Japanese Americans, the persecution of suspected communists under Joseph McCarthy. These are all fascist actions. Some of them precede the term fascism, but that doesn't change their nature. It's all about in-group, out-group, and reserving power to a chosen people. So members of the dominant group tend not to notice too much when other groups are being subjugated, and they may miss that that's fascism. That's happened a lot in American history. Probably the most noteworthy feature of the idea of American exceptionalism is the idea that it can't happen here. It is happening here, folks. It is happening here. We are not an exception. As it gains power, fascism escalates from just favoring the in-group in minor ways and labeling out-group members to limiting the out-group members' rights and freedoms, and finally to imprisoning, deporting, and killing the people that are being deemed inferior. The number of groups and individuals targeted grows, and in later stages, many people who thought they were safe end up being among the targets. That's how it succeeds, is by making you think you're part of the in-group and then gradually eroding away who counts, what the rights are. In Hitler's Germany, the targeted groups included Jews, Romani peoples, what we used to call gypsies, but that's considered a slur, homosexuals and transgender people, the mentally and physically disabled, and foreigners, anyone who wasn't considered a good example of Aryan superiority. You may notice that a lot of these groups are the same ones being targeted now, both officially and unofficially in the United States, along with Muslims. Well, it matters very much which groups are being targeted if you are among them. It doesn't actually matter to fascism who they're picking. What matters is the chosen people and the raising of specters of fear and hatred against others, whoever the others are. They usually start with an easy target, someone that not very many people will like and stand up for, and then escalate from there. So back to historian Robert Paxton. He goes into more detail describing fascism as a form of political behavior marked by obsessive preoccupation with community decline, humiliation, or victimhood, and by compensatory cults of unity, energy, and purity, in which a mass-based party of committed nationalist militants, working in uneasy but effective collaboration with traditional elites, abandons democratic liberties and pursues with redemptive violence and without ethical or legal restraints goals of internal cleansing and external expansion. I hope that that description sounds disturbingly familiar to all of you. It does to me. So if that's fascism, what is anti-fascism? Anti-fascism is very simply and literally opposition to fascism. In many languages, it is abbreviated to Antifa or Antifa. You may hear it pronounced a number of ways because it's come from different languages and coming into English. Became a familiar word in the US just in the last couple of years, but anti-fascists have actually existed as long as fascism has, and have been using variations on the word Antifa to describe themselves since the 1930s. Maybe new to a lot of us, it has been happening all along. Anti-fascist groups exist all over the world. Antifa or anti-fascism is not itself a group. It doesn't have a definable membership list. It doesn't have a dogma or a set of political beliefs. It's a movement like the civil rights movement or feminism. You can't say these people are feminism. Well, there are people who might be notable speakers for the movement. There's not a membership list. They often do draw on each other's symbolism, rhetoric, or tactics, these groups in all different places, based on shared values and goals and what turns out to work. For instance, lots of them use names that are a variation on Antifa, which comes from the 1930s German movement, I'm probably going to pronounce this wrong, Antifascistische Action, so founded in 1932 and inspired many groups since. They also used a logo with a pair of flags, and you'll see lots of anti-fascist groups using a logo with flags, black or red or a combination, that are originally derived from that group. And you'll hear some of them using the same slogans like "No pasaran," they shall not pass, or no KKK, no fascist USA. Because these slogans are catchy, they key into particular historical successes or inspirational moments in the history of anti-fascism, and so they get used again, even though these are different people in different groups. There are anti-fascists who use black bloc tactics, concealing their faces with black bandanas and using violence. Anti-fascism includes the black bloc, but it is not limited to it or defined by it. Some anti-fascists never use violence, others use it very selectively, others specifically choose to participate in events where they think violence is necessary, because that's the role they want to take. Some anti-fascist activists are socialists or communists, some are anarchists. All three of those groups have been really important in anti-fascist history in the past. Many current anti-fascists are fine with both capitalism and democracy in general, and they just have some difficulties with how they're being implemented in their particular country right now. No matter what their political stance in general, anti-fascists are most successful when they band together across political beliefs, classes, religion, whatever, and focus on their common goals of combating fascism. I can't possibly do justice to the entire history of anti-fascism in a few minutes, but I'm going to try to kind of give you a sense of the shape of it, based largely on the stories from this book. I found this book incredibly informative. I did find it a little bit of a difficult read at first, and that was easier when I supplemented by looking at Wikipedia for kind of the general historical structure that this fit into. So this is called Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook. And while it's called a handbook, it's actually about half history and half, hey, here's advice from people who've been in the movement, and here's some things we can take from past actions. So I'm kind of trying to provide a little bit of both in this talk, drawing heavily on this book, but also a few other sources. So I'm going to try to give a general shape and context of anti-fascism in Europe and North America from the 19th century to today. Obviously, I can only touch on things very lightly. And then move on to what we can learn from that history about effective anti-fascist action. So, anti-fascist movements first arose in Italy after World War II, pacing Mussolini's rise to power. About 1920, there were multiple Italian anti-fascist groups that were founded, drawing heavily from the labor movement, and these anti-fascist groups soon appeared in countries all over Europe. In 1920s and 30s Germany, there were Communist Party members, Social Democratic Party members, and other groups that banded together to fight repression and defend against the paramilitary groups and later the Nazi Party, often committing direct action and violence. The most prominent of these movements was the aforementioned Antifascistische Action, which by its name, its tactics, and its logo have inspired many groups across the world through today. And in 1930s Spain, before and during the Spanish Civil War, there were numerous large anti-fascist movements. Spanish anarchist and communist anti-fascist groups were joined by thousands of people from other countries, including George Orwell and Ernest Hemingway. People came from all over to join in the fight against Franco and fascists in Spain, and also to document the war in the case of Orwell and Hemingway and other reporters who also fought. The siege of Madrid was a high point in the clash and a big success for the anti-fascists, who were extremely outnumbered and outgunned, but still had successes that shaped history. Some of these groups and individuals continued to fight Franco's regime long after the war ended, into the 1960s. In France, in the 1920s and 30s, anti-fascist groups first confronted fascist far-right groups and then morphed into the French resistance once France was occupied. So a lot of these cases, first they were fighting just little fascist groups, and then once the groups took over, they were resistance fighters against a government. So some of these were the same people, sometimes they were the same groups, but they shifted roles from fighting a kind of insurgence in their country to fighting what had become the government of their country. At this point in our country, we're in a kind of a transitional state between those that I find very alarming. Most of the tactics in here are for fighting fascism when it's not in charge yet. One needs some new books. So resistance cells in France engaged in guerrilla warfare. They published underground newspapers. They helped people escape the Nazis. They had a diverse range of things they did to fight the fascist occupation. In the United Kingdom, Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists gained power in the 1930s, and it was countered by often violent efforts from coalitions of communists, socialists, anarchists, Jewish and Catholic working class people, and others. There were all these different groups who all recognized the fascist threat and banded together. The Battle of Cable Street was a particularly notable moment in this struggle. There was widespread disagreement at the time about the appropriateness of the use of violence, whether throwing rocks at fascists was inappropriate or unethical. And I think this is very relevant today. We're talking about fascists who were actually taking power during a world, in the setting of World War II. I think it should be clear where it was going in retrospect, and we should be able to use that to illuminate where we are right now and not be thinking, oh, this is just some harmless people talking in the street or something. The National Communist Party leadership at the time in the UK favored large demonstrations rather than direct action. And there was a wide range of opinions. Well-known anti-fascists disagree with each other quite a bit. In the United States in the 1930s, we had Nazi groups. People aren't necessarily aware of that. That's not taught in schools a lot. But we had very vocal present Nazi groups in the US. And we had the Ku Klux Klan. And of course, we had anti-fascists. They've been around every time there were fascists, including those who joined the Spanish Civil War efforts. But most people didn't really consider fascism a real threat until Hitler invaded Poland, and not really a threat to the United States until Pearl Harbor. So there's kind of a delay between anti-fascists going, whoa, this is a threat right now, I'm going to take some direct action, and the kind of mainstream popular opinion going, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine, oh wait, this is a problem. Then World War II itself, the Allied effort in World War II, of course, was a massive international anti-fascist action, but we don't usually use those terms to describe it. We usually use anti-fascist to mean individual or small group, unofficial actions outside of government and military action. After World War II, most people seem to think the anti-fascist job was pretty much over and people should stand down and go away. We're done, we won. That fact probably contributed to the rise and continuation of anti-fascist groups in a lot of places.
Of fascist groups?
Oh, sorry, of fascist groups, thank you. Germany was pretty determined in how they shut down Nazi groups and have continued to have laws against promoting Nazism, and they don't have as much of a Nazi problem as we do. We can talk about free speech. I can talk chapters on free speech. We have exceptions to it. They're valid. So there were groups that continued fighting fascist presence whenever it arose. The history of anti-fascism shows that it wanes every time fascism wanes and comes back when fascism comes back. Some people are concerned that anti-fascists are going to have a scope creep and start attacking anyone who disagrees with them. Historically, that hasn't been what's happened. For the past 100 years, anti-fascists have shown up when they're fascists, gone away when they're not there anymore. Through the following decades, anti-fascism was largely dormant in most areas. There are obvious exceptions. I can't cover everything. Let's jump to the 70s and 80s. In the UK, fascist and far-right parties like the National Front were on the rise, and anti-fascist groups were coming out after them. In 1977, thousands of people disrupted a National Front march in London in what was called the Battle of Lewisham. And the Anti-Nazi League was formed soon after that by the Socialist Workers' Party. They pursued both propaganda campaigns and direct action. Anti-Fascist Action was another group that appeared a little later, continued through the 90s. Here's an interesting setting that might not show up in history books. In the 80s, the punk scene developed a huge Nazi problem. And this wasn't just in the US or the UK, it was internationally. And this rise in white supremacist skinhead violence, where racist skinheads would show up and literally start bashing heads of people of color or immigrants, whoever they thought wasn't them, was met with a rise of anti-racist punk groups. The anti-racist skinheads were ultimately successful in driving the racist skinheads out of the punk scene. And they did that with a combination of blacklisting, refusing to book racist bands and kicking out their fans, preemptive violence. Someone walks in with a no remorse shirt. No remorse is a white supremacist band, you punch that person. That's what they did. And also having conversations with people who were maybe on the verge of joining one of these racist skinhead groups, getting them into an anti-racist group instead. So there was a combination of banning, violence, and talking to people that was ultimately really successful in getting the racists out of the punk scene and not letting them have a platform there. And the same kinds of tactics were used by both the racists and the anti-racists in the movement. It was really dispersed across the whole scene internationally. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a surge of fascist activity in Europe, accompanied by a surge of anti-fascist protest. We're currently dealing with Marine Le Pen in France. Her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, visited London in 1991. He was the right-wing leader then. He was met by a massive protest from the campaign against fascism in Europe, and that sparked efforts elsewhere. So there's an ongoing pattern of there's a big fascist move, there's a huge anti-fascist response that's very successful, and then that sparks more counter-fascist actions. So in the US, most recently, anti-fascist activity has risen really rapidly in response to the election of Donald Trump. We've got this increase in violent attacks and acts of government oppressions. We've got both the unofficial and the official actions against Muslims, immigrants, homosexual and transgender people, people of color, all being targeted for either removal of rights, things like being detained and families being separated, changing definitions of sex in order to dismiss transgender people and remove their rights. We've got all these official things going on, and also the unofficial attacks emboldened by Trump saying, yeah, I'll pay your legal fees, yeah, that's my kind of guy. So we've got anti-fascists coming out to counter that. Probably the oldest current US anti-fascist group is Portland's Rose City Antifa, which was founded in 2007, and it was only then that the word came to most Americans' awareness. As you've heard, it's existed all along. We just heard about it. Anti-fascists have shouted down Milo Yiannopoulos, they punched Richard Spencer, they publicly identified Nazis and got them fired. They've gotten multiple alt-right gatherings canceled either by the police or by their hosts. They've showed up in much greater numbers than Proud Boys and other white supremacists to the white supremacist own gatherings. And they've defended targets from violent white supremacists in Charlottesville and other places. So that was a huge info dump that only covered a little bit, but I hope it gives you a little bit of the shape of it. So what can we learn from this century or so of anti-fascist history? What worked? Let's get some examples. In the 1937 Spanish Civil War, we had the siege of Madrid. I'm going to read you a little bit of a scene here. It was March 1937, and the Spanish Civil War was raging. Generalissimo Francisco Franco, the eventual leader of the military rebellion that broke out against the Second Spanish Republic in July 1936, was increasingly desperate to conquer the capital to cement the legitimacy of his authority. Yet the defense of Madrid had proven far more resilient than he had ever imagined. "No pasarán," the people shouted. "They shall not pass." To turn the tide, Franco called upon the forces that Mussolini, like Hitler, had sent to Spain in violation of the neutrality agreement that France and Britain were still conscientiously observing. Mussolini had outfitted a force of 35,000 men with 250 tanks, 180 artillery, and 4 motorized machine gun companies. They got stuck in the mud outside Guadalajara. Their air support was grounded in flooded airfields, and they faced intermittent attacks over 5 days from a range of forces that included the 11th International Brigade, the 12th International Brigade, an anarchist militia, and just this general international effort bombarding them. A trickle of desertions turned into a full-scale collapse, and the Spanish Republic claimed its first victory of the war. This was huge for anti-fascist morale. Ernest Hemingway argued it is impossible to overemphasize the importance of this battle, which energized international anti-fascism after a decade and a half of continual defeat. So that slogan of "No pasarán," they shall not pass, when they were blocking access to the city, that's been used over and over again since, because it's an invocation of the power of anti-fascist cooperation and action, and it invokes that success in the Spanish Civil War. So, really important there, banding together is critical. All of these people from different countries, different political views, all saw the critical fact that they had to oppose fascism, and they worked together. And when anti-fascists have a big visible success, especially when they're outmanned by this huge governmental force and still succeed, that's enormous for morale, and it improves the recruiting and the determination of the anti-fascist side. So that's great. Kind of similar scene on a much smaller scale in the 1940s in the UK, when the 43 group shut down Mosley's fascist union movement. There's a plaque at the site that says, "The people of East London rallied to Cable Street on the 4th of October 1936 and forced back the march of the fascist Oswald Mosley and his black shirts through the streets of the East End. They shall not pass." Again, invoking that earlier effort. The anti-fascist groups in this case built roadblocks. They were preventing this march from happening. And they built roadblocks. 20,000 anti-fascist demonstrators turned out. They were met by 6,000 or 7,000 policemen who tried to clear the road. The demonstrators fought back with sticks, rocks, furniture, garbage, rotten vegetables, chamber pot contents. Women in houses along the street were throwing things out the windows at the police and the fascist marchers. After a series of battles, Mosley agreed to abandon the march to prevent bloodshed. So basically they got it canceled by everybody participating with whatever they had. Throughout the 1940s, the anti-fascists used a whole bunch of tactics to disrupt Mosley's group's meetings. Some of them were violent. Some of them were things like coming in and occupying the space before the group could start. You know, if you've got several thousand anti-fascists taking up the space, they can't have the rally. So that's a form of no platforming, simply removing the ability of fascists to meet, to organize, to get their message out. I kind of already covered what worked in the punk scene, which is a combination of recognizing the signifiers people are putting out, blacklisting them or committing violence. But there was also another tactic that I thought was really interesting. And let me find that one here. Hey, are you part of the White Knights? A young Native American skinhead graffiti artist named Gator shouted across the street to a young white skinhead, "Are you a white knight?" "So, are you?" "Yeah, I am," the kid responded. Taking a step closer, Gator explained that the next time he saw him, the answer had better be no. That actually worked on a number of people who were brand new members of racist skinhead groups or thinking about joining racist skinhead groups. Confronting them individually without committing violence on them yet, letting them know that there would be consequences if they persisted in working with racist skinhead groups, and then winning them over to the non-racist skinhead groups. It really multiplied the effect of the anti-fascist action. Go, I'm giving you a chance. You don't actually want to be this kind of a jerk and get punched in the face next time I see you, right? It really worked. And, well, it might be a little bit of a stretch to call that nonviolent. They weren't punching him yet. I thought that was kind of a genius approach, honestly. I kind of used up a lot of time here, but I want to do kind of a quick listing of some approaches that have been used. In Charlottesville, the anti-fascists used weapons like clubs. They used dyed liquids to dump on people. They physically blocked the fascists from their targets to try to protect the targets. They threatened, they chased people with sticks. They provided refreshments and music and training to counter-protesters. And then we're looking at the most recent things like Yiannopoulos and Spencer, who are very visible white supremacist speakers. Yiannopoulos has been shouted down. He's been prevented from giving talks. And while that got him a lot of publicity, he's also not getting more income out of it. And people got the message that he was not considered an acceptable person to have at your university or whatever group you had. This was not, you don't get to support that. Richard Spencer got punched in the face twice in one day by completely unrelated people because he is out there being a public Nazi. He's giving talks saying that, espousing white supremacy, and getting punched and then having that punch be set to music for comedy purposes on the web. It's actually really humiliating. It makes him look stupid, and Nazis don't like looking stupid. One of the really important goals of anti-fascism is to make it no fun to be a Nazi. We want it to be inconvenient. We want it to be costly. We want it to be painful. And we want it to make you feel embarrassed and stupid. Nobody is going to want to join a racist skinhead group or the Proud Boys or whatever if everybody who's in those groups is getting outed and fired from their jobs, they're getting punched, they're having their rallies broken up every single week. We want to make it as inconvenient and no fun as possible. And then the fascist action greatly reduces when that happens. Few quick lessons. Fascists gain power legally. Don't rely on the government or the laws to keep us from sliding into fascism. That's not how fascism works. Fascism uses whatever's there and then takes away the rights. Fascism is not politics as usual. Bad-mouthing political opponents is not the same thing as targeting categories of people as less than human and taking away their rights. Political parties often move too slowly to act against fascism. Smaller groups and individuals need to take initiative. Fascism will steal from leftist ideology and imagery and drop those things as soon as they're not useful anymore. Don't be misled. The ultimate values are all about in-group, out-group, and taking rights from people. And it doesn't take that many fascists to make fascism. Every single fascist group that took over a country started off tiny. Mussolini started with 100 fasci. Hitler started with 54 members in the German Workers' Party. If you crush those groups when they're small, you don't have to deal with them when they've taken over the country. We don't know how many times small groups may have been crushed that never did take over a country. It's hard to know, but we know sometimes when they have been. principles, you want to protect vulnerable targets, shield them, help them get safe. You want to disrupt the immediate fascist action, the rally or whatever is happening. You want to discourage future fascist action. If they know their meeting's going to be interrupted every week, maybe they'll stop meeting so much. If their press is smashed, they can't print their newsletter anymore. If they lose their jobs, they have fewer resources to work with. You want to feed anti-fascist and target morale and wreck fascist morale. Every anti-fascist success does that. And you want to communicate a message to onlookers. We're out here, we're fighting the fascists, you can join us. Encourages recruiting and assistance in the future. You need to calibrate your response to what you're fighting. Pick your battles. Don't show up if you're way outnumbered. It's going to be a bad idea. Show up when you can outnumber them. Select from a full range of tactics, from leafleting and talking to people who are maybe sympathizers, to legal interference, to obstruction of events, to violence. There's a whole range of things that are helpful to anti-fascism, and you want to pick what's appropriate to the given situation. It's really important to combine community involvement, working with locals, figuring out what they need, and direct action. If you do only direct action and you don't have the local connection, you don't have the support you need, and you may actually have opposition from locals if you don't understand what they're needing. So if you're coming from outside trying to do anti-fascist action, you want to be working with locals and find out, make sure that you're in sync. And quick listing just of the range of kinds of actions that you can do. I like this. The vast majority of anti-fascist tactics involve no physical violence whatsoever. Anti-fascists conduct research on the far right online, in person, and sometimes through infiltration. They dox them, push cultural milieus to disown them, pressure bosses to fire them, and demand that venues cancel their shows, conferences, and meetings. They organize educational events, reading groups, trainings, athletic tournaments, and fundraisers. They write articles, leaflets, and newspapers, drop banners, and make videos. They support refugees and immigrants, defend reproductive rights, and stand up against police brutality. But it is also true that some of them punch Nazis in the face and don't apologize for it. So, whole range. So, in conclusion, anti-fascism works best when a broad range of people across classes, religions, and political and economic ideologies, and with local connections and support, band together to oppose fascist action, choosing from all the tactics at their disposal. The more people are involved, the more people from more privileged groups stand up for the target groups, and the more thoroughly and often fascist activity is countered, the better it goes. The more embarrassing, inconvenient, and dangerous anti-fascists make it to be a fascist, the fewer fascists there'll be.